The sun beats down on the crimson sands of southern Jordan, creating a shimmering heat haze that distorts the horizon. To the untrained eye, this landscape appears as nothing but barren wasteland, a punishing expanse of rock and dust where life struggles to take hold. But if you listen closely to the wind whistling through the canyons, you can almost hear the echoes of a civilization that defied the odds. 2,000 years ago, in the heart of this desert abyss, the Nabataeans carved a metropolis out of rose-colored cliffs. They built a city of temples, tombs, and theaters that rivaled Rome itself. But their greatest achievement was not the stone monuments we see today. It was something invisible, something hidden beneath the sand and the stone. This is the story of Petra's hidden flood traps, the story of a desert city that outsmarted water. It is a tale of genius engineering, survival against the elements, and a battle against nature's most terrifying weapon, the flash flood. As we step back in time, the first thing that strikes you about ancient Petra is the paradox of its existence. It sits in a valley that is technically a canyon, a geological bowl surrounded by towering sandstone peaks. It is beautiful, yes, but it is also a death trap. Geography dictates that this is one of the driest places on Earth, where rain is a rare and precious memory. Yet, when the rain does come, it does not fall gently. It arrives with vengeance. The mountains that ring the city act as a giant funnel. When a storm breaks over the highlands, millions of gallons of water rush down the steep slopes, gathering speed and force, turning the dry riverbeds or wadis into violent torrents of mud, rock, and debris. In a natural state, Petra should have been washed away 1,000 times over. But the Nabataeans were not just architects, they were masters of hydrology. They understood that to survive in the desert, you had to control the water. You had to tame the monster. Imagine standing at the entrance of the Sick, the narrow, winding gorge that serves as the gateway to the city. It is a kilometer of towering rock, a fissure in the earth that blocks out the sun. For a traveler approaching Petra in the 1st century BC, this was the road to paradise, but it was also the most dangerous point of entry. A single flash flood in the Sick would trap anyone inside, crushing them against the walls or sweeping them away into the void. The Nabataeans knew this. They knew that the same water that could destroy their trade routes could also quench the thirst of their city. And so, they devised a system so brilliant that it remained hidden for centuries, right in plain sight. As you walk through the Sick today, you might notice a groove carved into the side of the cliff face. To the casual observer, it looks like a natural weathering pattern. But in reality, it is the remnants of a terracotta pipeline that once ran for kilometers, bringing fresh spring water from the mountains outside the city all the way to the heart of the metropolis. This was the lifeblood of Petra, but the pipeline was only half the story. Beneath the sandstone path under your feet lies a complex network of dams and cisterns. The most brilliant of these was the barrier dam built at the entrance of the Sick. When the floodwaters came roaring down from the mountains, this dam caught the massive surge of water. Instead of letting it tear through the gorge and destroy the city, the dam diverted the flow into a tunnel carved directly through the solid rock. This water was then channeled away from the city center and into large reservoirs, or cisterns, where it was stored. They were turning a destructive flood into a usable resource. They were trapping the water. This engineering feat was not just about survival. It was about power and perception. Water in the desert was currency. It was wealth. The ability to provide water in a land of drought meant the Nabataean kings could control the trade caravans that passed through. These caravans, laden with frankincense and myrrh from Arabia and spices from India, needed water for their thousands of camels. Petra became the Vegas of the ancient world, an oasis of luxury in the middle of nowhere, funded by the control of water. But the city itself was a display of that power. The treasury, that magnificent facade immortalized in Hollywood films, was not just a tomb. It was a symbol of a civilization that could command nature. Walk deeper into the valley, past the treasury, and the city opens up into a wide plain. Here, the true scale of the Nabataean hydromastery reveals itself. The ground is not flat by accident. It was meticulously graded. The entire valley floor was sloped and engineered to direct rainwater toward specific points. Large, open-air cisterns were dug into the rock, capable of holding millions of liters of water. But the most ingenious part was the filtration system. They did not just want muddy water. They wanted clean, drinkable water. They built sedimentation tanks where the heavy silt would settle to the bottom before the water flowed into the storage tanks. They even used sand and gravel as natural filters. This was high-tech engineering for an era that predated the Roman aqueducts by centuries. However, the system was not without its weaknesses, and the history of Petra is marked by a constant struggle against the sheer force of nature. There is a darker side to this story, a reminder that even the smartest civilizations are at the mercy of the elements. Archaeologists have found evidence of massive flood events that breached the defenses. In one corner of the city, you can see a broken dam that the Nabataeans tried to rebuild and reinforce, but the water was too strong. It is a testament to the violence of these desert storms. Yet every time the water knocked them down, they built back better. They raised the walls. They dug the channels deeper. They widened the tunnels. They were obsessed with outsmarting the flood. The psychological impact of this water infrastructure on the daily life of the people cannot be overstated. In a city that received perhaps 6 inches of rain a year, the sound of running water was a miracle. It was a religious experience. The Nabataeans worshipped a variety of gods, but many of their deities were associated with water and storms. Dushara, the supreme god, was often linked to the mountain and the rain. The engineering feats were not just practical. They were sacred offerings. When the priests turned a wheel and opened a sluice gate to release water from a cistern into the city as fountains, it was a sign that the gods favored them. It was a ritual that reinforced the bond between the king, the people, and the divine. The hidden flood traps were a mechanism of salvation. Let us reconstruct a specific moment in time to understand the drama of this system. It is the year 50 AD. The Nabataean kingdom is at its peak under King Aretas IV. The city is bustling with thousands of inhabitants, merchants from Egypt, Syria, and Greece. The air is thick with the smell of spices and dust. Suddenly, the sky turns black. Clouds gather over the jagged peaks of the Shara Mountains. The wind picks up, howling through the canyon. To anyone else, this is a terrifying moment. But in Petra, the alarm bells ring not in panic, but in precision. A team of engineers rushes to the diversion points upstream. They check the integrity of the dams. They clear the intake channels of debris. The rain begins to fall. It is a torrential downpour, turning the dust into slippery mud within seconds. High above the city, the wadis, a brown wall of water, 10 feet high, crashes down the mountainside, carrying boulders the size of cars. It heads straight for the royal tombs, but just as it reaches the city limits, it hits the first line of defense, a large dam that spans the width of the valley. The water rises behind the wall, its power temporarily spent against the stone. Then the engineers open the massive floodgates. The water is forced into a side channel, a man-made canyon carved specifically for this purpose. It rushes past the theater, safely diverted away from the marketplaces and the houses. The water roars like a beast, but it is a beast in a cage. It flows harmlessly around the city and pours into the massive reservoirs to the south. Within hours, the rain stops, the sun comes out, and where there was almost a disaster, there is now a city brimming with fresh water. The fountains bubble, the cisterns are full. Petra has survived again. This was the magic of Petra. It was a city that lived on a knife's edge, balancing between drought and deluge. The hidden flood traps were the safety net that allowed them to walk that line. But why is this history so important to us today? Because it is a story of adaptation. We live in a world where water scarcity is becoming a critical issue, where climate change is causing weather patterns to become more extreme. We are seeing more droughts and more floods, often in the same places. The Nabataeans faced a similar existential crisis 2,000 years ago, and they did not run away from it. They did not fight the water with force alone. They used their brains. They respected the power of the flood and learned to harness it. As the centuries rolled on, the Nabataean kingdom eventually faded. The trade routes shifted to the sea, bypassing the desert caravans. The city was slowly abandoned, swallowed by the sand and forgotten by the West for over 1,000 years. The intricate system of dams and tunnels fell into disrepair. The sediment filled the cisterns. The earthquakes shook the foundations of the dams. When the Swiss explorer Johann Ludwig Burckhardt rediscovered Petra in 1812, he saw the majestic facades, but he did not see the veins of the city, the water channels that were buried under centuries of debris. For a long time, historians wondered how such a massive city could have survived in such a dry place. Some even suggested it was a purely ceremonial site, not a permanent residence. They couldn't fathom the engineering capability required to sustain a population of 20,000 people in a wasteland. It took modern archaeologists using satellite imagery and ground-penetrating radar to truly uncover the extent of the hidden flood traps. They found that Petra was not just a city carved in rock, it was a city carved in water. Every street was a canal. Every flat surface was a catchment area. The landscape itself was a tool to capture every single drop of rain that fell from the sky. The realization changed our understanding of the Nabataeans. They were not just nomadic traders who got lucky and settled in a pretty canyon. They were sophisticated scientists who understood fluid dynamics, soil mechanics, and urban planning. They outsmarted water, and in doing so, they created a paradise. But there is a poignancy to this success. The very system that allowed Petra to thrive also contributed to its mysterious atmosphere. The silence that hangs over the valley today is partly due to the absence of the sound of rushing water. The channels are dry. The cisterns are empty. The vibrant, wet city is now a dry archaeological park. The flood traps are no longer catching the water. The water is eroding the ruins. The tourists who walk the site today are protected by modern concrete barriers, a far cry from the elegant stone solutions of the ancients. We look at the ruins and admire the aesthetics, but we often miss the functionality. We see the skin of the city, but we have lost the pulse. Consider the sheer will it took to build this. There were no steam shovels, no steel drills, no diesel-powered trucks. The Nabataeans chiseled the diversion tunnels out of solid sandstone using hand tools and the strength of their backs. They hauled heavy stones up steep cliffs to build the dams. They crafted thousands of pipes by hand and fitted them together with waterproof mortar. This was a generational project. A father might have started a dam that his son finished, and his grandson maintained. It was a labor of love and necessity. It was a covenant with the future. They built these traps not just for themselves, but for the children who would live in the valley long after they were gone. They wanted to ensure that the desert would never claim them. The story of these flood traps also challenges our modern view of ancient civilizations. We often think of the ancients as being at the mercy of nature, worshiping the sun and the rain out of fear. But in Petra, we see a transition. They still worshiped the gods, but they also took action. They didn't just pray for the flood to stop. They built a wall to stop it. This is the birth of the scientific mindset. It is the realization that humans can observe the natural world, understand its laws, and manipulate them for their benefit. The hidden nature of the traps was not just about physical concealment. It was about hiding the mechanism of the miracle. To the common trader passing through, the water just appeared. It seemed like magic. But the magic was actually engineering. As we visualize the city in its prime, we can almost see the water flowing. We can see the fountains in the royal court, spraying mist into the air, cooling the nobles in the desert heat. We can see the lush gardens that were watered by the runoff, creating a green oasis in the red rock. We can hear the laughter of children playing by the pools, safe from the ravages of the desert. This was the dream that the Nabataeans made real. They took the harshest environment on earth and made it home. They looked at the flood, the bringer of death, and saw a bringer of life. The lesson of Petra is that survival is not about conquering nature, but about working with it. The flood traps did not try to stop the water entirely. They allowed it to flow, just in a different direction. They redirected the energy. They used the force of the flood to fill their cisterns. It was a symbiotic relationship. In our modern world, we often try to pave over nature, to build walls that keep everything out, or to channel rivers into concrete straitjackets. But Petra teaches us that flexibility and integration are more durable than brute force. The Nabataeans worked asterisk with asterisk the geography of the canyon, using its natural slopes and contours to guide the water where they wanted it to go. Even the name of the valley suggests this connection. The Wadi Musa, or the Valley of Moses, is named after the biblical figure who struck a rock and brought forth water. Whether the Nabataeans knew this story or not, they essentially performed the same miracle on a massive scale. They struck the rock of the canyon walls and the mountains above, and they brought forth a river. They tamed the liquid chaos. And in doing so, they secured their place in history. As the sun sets over the ridges of Petra, casting long shadows across the ancient tombs, the silence returns. But if you close your eyes, you can imagine the roar of the ancient flood, rushing through the hidden tunnels, echoing in the chambers beneath the sand. You can imagine the clatter of the engineers running to check the gates, the rush of the water filling the cisterns, the collective sigh of relief as the city realizes it is safe once more. This was the rhythm of life here, the constant cycle of dryness and deluge, threat and sustenance. The hidden flood traps of Petra are more than just archaeological curiosities. They are monuments to human resilience. They remind us that no matter how hostile the environment, no matter how scarce the resources, the human mind is capable of finding a solution. We are problem solvers. We are adapters. The Nabataeans are gone. Their empire dissolved into the sands of time, but their waterworks remain, a silent testimony to their genius. They outsmarted the water, and for a glorious few centuries, they turned the desert into a garden. When we look at the challenges of our own time, the rising seas, the drying rivers, the extreme storms, we can look back to Petra for inspiration. We can remember that a civilization thrived not by ignoring the problem, but by facing it head-on with innovation and determination. The city was not just built on stone. It was built on the understanding that water is life, but only if you respect its power. So the next time you see a picture of the treasury in Petra, don't just see a beautiful building carved into a cliff. Look at the ground beneath it. Imagine the channels running beneath the sand. Think of the rain falling miles away, rushing down the mountain, and being captured, tamed, and used. That is the real secret of Petra. That is the hidden story. It is a story of a people who refused to let the desert dictate their fate. They engineered their own destiny, drop by drop, flood by flood. And in the end, that legacy is far more enduring than the stone monuments themselves, for it is a blueprint for survival in a world that is always changing. The silence of the ruins is deceptive. The stones are dry, but the history is saturated with the memory of water. The flood traps lie dormant now, waiting for a rain that may never come in the same way again. But the idea lives on. The idea that we can outsmart the elements, that we can find a way to thrive in the hardest of places. Petra, the desert city, outsmarted water, and in doing so, it conquered time itself, leaving behind a message written in stone and sand that echoes across the centuries. Where there is a will to survive, there is a way to turn disaster into abundance. The desert city is not just a relic of the past. It is a mirror held up to our future, challenging us to be as wise as brave and as ingenious as those who once called the rose-red city home.